with what I was saying last time. I'm cooking lunch even though it's early. Because it's when I can do it. So anyway, let me just shut up this phone so I can start talking. We're done. So, sun. It's been sunny today, which is great. It's like the first time in about a month that we've seen the sun, and it's amazing, like how it affects the spirits, you know. Just I mean, I grew up in Liverpool, so rain and what we call muggy weather was kind of quite normal when I was growing up. But it's kind of funny how you can you get used to it just being nice all the time, you know, sunny, and it's kind of, although when you settle into it and it's just nice all the time, you don't notice. When you've been like through a month of not seeing the sun, and then you see the sun again, it just really lifts your spirits, you know. It's kind of it's quite profound, you know. You're like, you know, I don't know if there's something, you know, I don't know if it's like there's something to the fact that, you know, all of like the philosophies that make up the West actually came from places that were like, you know, Greece, Rome, you know what I mean? I don't know if that's just maybe it's just incidental, probably is. Anyway, so sort of not a million miles away from that thought of how the sun lifts your spirits, I've been reading a book by the psychologist Ian McGilchrist. It's called The Master and His Emissary. And it's basically about how the hemispheres of the brain interact. And so I'm only halfway through, or just over halfway through. But it's just, you know, it's amazing at the way. So, like, you've got parts of the brain that, although it's not exactly this, it's sort of, you know, you've probably heard people talking about left brain and right brain and things like that. So like the right brain is like the more intuitive part and the thing that finds like the whole meanings, whereas like the left brain is the bit that's like more analytical and sort of just like laser focused on, you know, tasks and sequences and things like that. And so it sort of compares how, you know, well, even things like the direction that we read and write in. So, like original, like the oldest form of like writing, which was pictograms. So pictograms are like whole meaning concepts, and that's all right brain. And so the right brain actually wants to read from top to bottom. Actually, is it top to bottom, bottom to top? But it wants to read vertically. But the left brain wants to read in lines. And so basically what like your left brain, what it really wants to do is read left to right, because that causes the major focus to be in the right eye, which is the left brain. And it's just, you know, it talks about, you know, what drives what. Did our behaviour drive the change in the brain? Did the change in the brain drive our behaviour, or is it some kind of feedback loop that's basically doing the whole thing at once? And it really made me think just about the way, you know, the way society's going at the moment. It's like it's incredibly left brain, but not so much. When I say that, I don't mean that it's all about, you know, oh, we're all so good, such good scientists and, you know, figuring things out. Like the left brain looks for the comfort in rules and structures, and it actually prefers commands over truth. And that's just so much of what, you know, what we can see going on at the moment. You know, all these, like, the schisms that we have in society at the moment. You know, just look at, you know, the whole left versus right paradigm in politics, you know, that we're seeing at the moment, and it's kind of, yeah, I've never felt like I've lived in a moment where people are just so desperate to like outsource reason to like political paradigms. And it's, you know, even though I'm talking about the way there's a massive sort of lack of understanding between the political left and the political right, but it's all mental left brainness. You know, it's just so, you know, give me the answer. You know, I don't want to see a bigger picture. I don't need to figure anything out for myself. I don't want to. Just tell me what is. And you know, that type of, when I say that the left brain prefers like commands over truth, this has been established in experiments with, you know, in people. So there's like a thing where people can have the, you know, the sides of the brain disassociated either through surgery or, I think it's just probably just all surgery. And you know, you can actually see that people, you can show certain stimuli so that it's only received by one side of the brain at a time. And the left brain will completely lie, you know, just lie to itself, or you know, lie to whoever is questioning it about, you know, what's going on. Just if it thinks that it can conform to a neat paradigm that's enforced by rules, then it'll do it. And that's just exactly what's going on. There's no room, as far as I can see, in modern society to actually, you know, there's no one empowering anyone to just like, you know, think for yourself, do your own thing. You know, whether it's right or left, it's just collectivism to the nth degree. And you know, it's taken us to some, you know, quite some scary places at the moment. You know, I think this is the first time since the end of the Cold War that I've actually, you know, been concerned that, you know, people are trying to take us to war at the moment. You know, people are doing things to actively, like the EU is absolutely actively provoking Russia. Now, I'm not saying that, you know, that we need to be, you know, just say, oh, you know, obviously Russia's so powerful that we've got to do everything that Russia wants. You know, no one should be placating anyone, but I can't really see what this whole Ukraine thing has got to do with the West. You know, I saw an interesting podcast with David Starkey, and he's, you know, he's an old guy. He's a historian, and he's kind of like he was talking about, you know, Ukraine wasn't really ever a country anyway. You know, so I'm not saying that it's entirely excusable that, you know, a place that is a country now gets invaded by another country, and you know, I'm not saying that this is just all okay, but there's a lot, you know, there's a massive amount of context that we're just not getting. And also, I honestly don't believe that most of the politicians who are actually driving this conflict from like the European Union, they're well aware of, you know, the history of Ukraine, the history of Russia, and they're well aware of what's going on. It's not like, you know, anything that, like, any of this has just been, you know, recently discovered. So, but the problem is the public isn't well aware. The public has no, you know, just no idea of, you know, what was Ukraine, you know, what does it even mean? You know, what does it mean for a Russian? You know, who who talks what, where, you know, it's like what languages are in play, and you know, there's none of that. And you know, there's some you know, very serious consequences associated with all this. I mean, you know, I've got a young son, so although I like think, you know, he's 11, so he's about to turn 12. You know, so military conscription sounds like it's a long way off, but it's not really. It's only 6 years away. And you know, this is, politicians are actually talking about conscriptions, and you know, it's just not on. You know, so obviously, as anyone who's watched more than one video, if this isn't your first video, you know, I definitely consider myself, you know, an anarchist or voluntarist, in the sense that, you know, people, I mean, basically the state has powers that if any individual tried to use them, then, you know, we wouldn't comprehend, you know, we wouldn't comprehend the concept of, you know, even mundane things like tax, you know, never mind military conscription. I mean, that's just the ultimate form of slavery, conscription. You know, it's just, you know, when we think back of like old empires who capture lands and, you know, force the inhabitants to be slaves, you know, is that not the same as, you know, sending your young men off to die? You know, it's just crazy. You know, so it worries me, but it's also coupled at the same time with, you know, it goes hand in hand with a total lack of, I don't know if it's personality or, you know, just, I was in Rome a couple of weeks ago, and obviously, when in Rome, you know, you go and see all the stuff. And what was just so striking to me, you know, I mean, it literally took me breath away when you see some of these things. And you just think of, like, you know, I think it's Nietzsche's will to power. You know, it's just like the actual, you know, the desire to do things, you know what I mean? You know, back in the day, when it absolutely wasn't just a case of, you know, come on lads, let's go and get we'll have a skip in the corner, you know, we'll put up you know what I mean? You can't just, there was no, all the infrastructure was just like, was people. You know, that was, the technology was people. You know, and whips, you know, I don't know. But you know, it was just doing stuff. You know, when the Romans decided, right, we're going to bring a marble pillar to Rome from Greece. You know, Greece is a long way away. Doing that today would be just such a massive undertaking. But they did it, you know, 1,000 years ago, longer. And it just shows you that, you know, the enthusiasm for life, you know what I mean? The kind of, I'm going to leave my mark on the world. It's just amazing. But, you know, what do we have today? We're bickering about, you know, perceived oppressions and, you know, oppressors, and, you know, we're just chasing our tails. It's just ridiculous, the lack of will to power. I'm not saying that we need to be all, you know, let's change the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, and let's go and get Greenland, and let's make Canada the 51st state. You know, that's not what I'm talking about. Although there's some aspect to it, you know, at least Trump's thinking about leaving a mark in history. You know, so not that I'm, you know, Trump's just another statist as far as I'm concerned. You know, I'm not like, not only did I not vote for him because I don't vote in the American elections, obviously, I don't vote in any elections because I don't believe that I have the right to force someone else how to live. And I fundamentally believe that that is my like founding principle. And so I think that's what I'm alluding to, I guess, is the fact that there are no principles in terms of, you know, what's like the nucleus of our society, you know, what are we based upon? Because at one point in time, I think people might have said, you know, we're based on like the concept of, you know, freedom and free speech and things like that, but we're just so obviously not now. You know, I've never known, there's never been a period of my life where I felt, in general, people have to be more careful about what they say. You know, it's just, you literally, you know, there are, not only are there certain words you can't say, but there's just certain things that you're not allowed to think in polite society. You know, if you look at anything that's on the telly, then everything's, you know, let's just say that thought is definitely leaning in one direction only. And it's, you know, it's kind of crazy because, you know, where's the next, you know, what happens after this? You know, it seems like, you know, what's the next thing that needs to be done? What can we do? Because after everyone just thinks the same, and I think what's worse is I've always known that there are certain things that you're not meant to say, and you know, there's, like, for instance, I've never liked racism, and I've never been a racist. It's just one of those things that I find distasteful. And even in, like, there's some like Telegram channels that like I kind of follow, and you know, some of them are right leaning and stuff, and so you might get like the occasional like racist joke or something, and I don't know, I don't like it. You know, just you know, don't get me wrong, when it's like a joke that's based on like a stereotype, some of that is funny, because, but just like, you know, most stereotypes do have some kind of foundation in like something that's true. So, you know, like there's things like when comedians make jokes about white people, I find that very funny as well, because there's just some things that are just innately true and get, you know, expressed or, you know, observed and commented on really well in humour. So, you know, like when Dave Chappelle's like talking about like white people and how they talk, it's funny, it's really funny, but mostly because there's lots of truth in it. Or like just, you know, someone comparing like a race to an animal or something is just like, you know, is that the best that you got, really? You know, that's just not, it's not funny, it's not clever. You know, it actually says more about the person who wrote it than anything else. But even though I find racism distasteful, I don't think, I strongly believe, stay there, that you know, that people should be allowed to say what they want. You know, I really don't believe in hate crime laws. I just find them, they're just too dangerous. Because basically, you're just getting, you know, if something, the fact that you have things called non-hate, what is it, non-hate, no, non-crime hate incidences or something like that they have in the UK. It's like, you know, on one side they're admitting that, you know, this isn't a crime, so we shouldn't. The fact that the police are involved is kind of strange. But on the other side, you've got like people, non-crime hate instances, I think it's called. You know, how have we got in a situation where the police can turn up for something that you post on Facebook? And to be honest, I haven't used Facebook for years, so it's one of those things. Well, it doesn't bother me. But you know, it's uncomfortable, and it's kind of, it just comes down to the fact that people are quite happy to be policed. You know, as long as, you know, I don't mind having losing a bit of my freedom, as long as it pisses the other guy off. You know what I mean? It's just crazy. It's infantile, and you know, this is just where we're going. And well, it's not even where we're going. This is where we are. You know, so what's the next step? I mean, do we physically, you know, the fact that you can get prosecuted for praying outside a place. I mean, what is praying? It's not, you know, it's literally talking to yourself. You know, so, you know, or, you know, whether you think that you're only talking to yourself is another matter, but, you know, the actual mechanism of it is that you're saying words in your head. So, we're okay with the fact that you're not allowed to say words inside your head depending on where you're standing. That just seems crazy to me. I mean, it's beyond blasphemy laws. It's worse than blasphemy laws. At least in a blasphemy law, you have to say it out loud. You have to say it to someone. You know, can you get away with praying somewhere if you can convince the judge that you're an atheist and that you were literally just saying it to yourself? And you're not allowed to say it to yourself. Can you whisper something horrible to yourself? Is that allowed? You know, it seems like it isn't. So you might be wondering, well, what's all this got to do with, you know, the kind of thing that I talk about in this channel is like, you know, keeping your weight under control, being happy, stuff like that. Where am I going with this? Well, I think where I'm going is just the fact that if people, you know, especially young people, if they're not prepared to push back against the state, you know, if you're not prepared to push back against the state when you're young, when are you going to do it? You know, it's not like, or maybe that was just the way it used to work. Maybe people aren't rebellious when they're young anymore. Maybe we just fall for the indoctrination when we're young, and it's only when we get a little bit older that we're like, oh man, this doesn't make sense, this is a bit crazy. How come, you know, everything that I'm being taught just favours the establishment? You know, why don't we see it as indoctrination when you're taught it from a state school? I mean, surely it is. I mean, surely that's the purpose as well. It's not like, I've had this conversation with people before, you go, oh, such and such is indoctrinated by, you know, whatever. It's like, well, you know, in a certain sense, surely that's what culture is anyway. Culture is indoctrination. You know, if we don't find a way to push the values of the culture into the next generation, then it's just over. You know, it will end. So, you know, I don't have a problem per se with certain values being taught, but where I do have the problem is saying that these are the only values. You know, any other values are not just like, they're not just wrong, they're evil, and that's where we're getting right now. So we've got to the point where I think I mean, it used to be one of the things that people always said, oh, the politicians, they argue when they're in Parliament, but then they're all just friends. And it's like, well, yeah, because they've got different political ideas. They don't hate each other, or they shouldn't hate each other. Because the whole point is, you know, we're getting... Politics nowadays is being framed in terms of, like, in apocalyptic terms. This is the last time we'll have an election. Everything's at stake in this election because if we don't, there won't be any more elections and all stuff. I mean, you know, this is someone who doesn't even vote. But I think people are scared into the fact that, you know, I think it's got to be a deliberate tactic, because if you just keep people afraid and, you know, you just keep everything moving, no one has a chance to actually sit back and think, oh, what's really going on here? Why, you know, who is all this noise favouring? And it's actually quite obvious. You know, it's not like, although, like, look at the pandemic, little businesses suffered terribly in the pandemic, but big business didn't. You know, Amazon in Spain, for instance, got a massive boost because of the pandemic. Massive. But lots of little shops ended up closing. And I think that happened in lots of parts of the world. But this only happens because people don't take the time to think. Or probably more accurately, they're not afforded the time to think. So everything's just too crazy and busy, and, you know, everyone's scared. That's another thing that I'm shocked at how scared everyone is about, like, climate change. So here we are in Spain and it's been raining for a month. Now that's not usual. It's not on average what happens, but it does happen. It has happened in the history of the world that in this part of the geography it's rained for a long time, and it's probably happened that it's rained for a lot longer than it has this time around as well. But we're just, it's like, oh, it's climate, all this rain, it's climate change. But then if it's hot, it's climate change. And then if it, you know, if we don't get rain, it's climate change. Too much rain, it's climate change. Just a completely normal amount of rain, it's like, well, climate change is on the way. You know, it's not an accident. And I'm not even saying that everyone who complain, I mean, the people who are most scared by climate change obviously believe in it. You know, and I'm not saying, I mean, climate does change, I know it does. You know, there's no reason, if you look at the history of the world and the climate, it's not like it's steady. But if you take any two arbitrary points, then you can see it getting hotter, getting colder, more rain, less rain. You know, there's you know, we can find scary data wherever you want. But we're not getting anywhere, we're not achieving anything by scaring people into, well, now we need electric cars. Because it's not, it doesn't make sense. You know, there's no plan. But, you know, young people can't see. Well, obviously, because you're young, you've got no other frame of reference. So, as I didn't when I was young. But now it's just so obvious, well, at least to someone who's like nearly 50 years old, that it's obvious that none of this isn't done on purpose. So, where am I going with this? I mean, people really need to take a step back and just think, you know, what can I do? So, you know, if you are scared about climate change, then what can you do? You know, what should you do? What changes should you make? But you know, it's set up in a way where for all the problems that we see at the global level, any one individual making a change won't achieve anything. And it's kind of done like that on purpose, because that way you think, well, we need to have, you know, nobody should be able to drive a car. You know, we all should, you know, live in 15-minute cities. But if you actually think about it properly, the two countries, if all of this was true, for instance, in terms of climate change, right? And you know, it's just too much carbon dioxide. So more than half of the carbon dioxide in the world is produced by China and India. So if this was an absolute existential threat, imagine if carbon dioxide was actually poisonous to us, and like we had two countries that were just pumping in poisonous gas into the air, and you know, it goes into other countries and kills people. So if that was the case, something would be done. You know, it's not like everyone will be like, oh well, you know, oh it's too expensive. No, it's like, you know, if it wasn't like carbon dioxide, if two countries in the world were pumping out poisonous gas that was like falling other countries and killing them, then something would be done. But the whole fact that nothing's being done, well, I don't say nothing effective is being done. What's being done? You have to drive an electric car. You can't go into the city with a diesel engine. You know, that doesn't make sense. It's not for that. And if you can't figure out that it's not for that, excuse me, then I don't know what to tell you. But the solution is, it really is personal responsibility. It really is, you know, what can I do? How can I change? What needs to be done? And as soon as people actually take the time to figure out, you know, what's true and what's not true, that's when things will start changing. That's when people won't be relying on politicians. Oh, please give me the solution, tell me what to do, because they don't know either. They're just, you know, following agendas of bigger interests as well. So anyway, that was a very roundabout way of basically getting to the point of, I really do believe that it's the individual, not the collective, that's going to solve the problems that we have. And you know, I think that that's just something that I think will become more and more obvious as time goes on. As time goes on and nothing good happens, you know, and the collectivism just doesn't get us anywhere. But all the time, we're still blaming the individuals. Oh, look at that, look at him, look at that. Anyway, I am going to finish now. I am not going to eat my lunch because it's way too early. But I'll see you in another day. I've still got the 30-day damn boss challenge thingy-majig, which I need to rehearse. But you can download it. The idea is an experiment for 30 days in just self-empowerment. What can I change to make my life better? And I think you know, give it a go. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. So anyway, we're done for today. See you soon.